She played a vital role in shaping the early life of the future king, then vanished without a trace. But what followed sent quiet shockwaves through the palace for nearly a decade. Maria Theresa Turrion-Borrallo had been the most trusted presence in Prince George's world, though her name was virtually unknown outside palace walls. More than a nanny, she was a steady, loving force in a world where every moment of a child's life was watched, controlled, and curated. She was always there, just beyond the camera's edge, the voice whispering "be kind" before school, the hands packing snacks and secrets, the voice singing lullabies from a land far from Buckingham Palace. And then, she was gone. There was no formal announcement, no goodbye photo, not even a brief palace statement. One day she was part of his life, and the next, she wasn't. Royal sources chalked it up to a routine change, but those paying close attention were stunned. Maria hadn't just cared for the young prince, she had shaped who he was becoming. And then she left it all behind, or so it seemed. As is often the case in royal circles, the truth was more complex. Beneath the perfect smiles and immaculate uniforms, a quiet shift had begun, not only in George's life, but within the monarchy itself. Subtle restructuring was underway. The heir was growing, and with his growth came new boundaries about who stayed close and who stepped aside. Maria's departure wasn't just a matter of timing, it marked the beginning of a deeper unraveling in a system founded on discretion, tradition, and unwavering loyalty. Yet Maria didn't resist. She gave no interviews, published no tell-all, revealed no secrets. She left with a poise only heartbreak could carry. For a while, it seemed that would be the end of her story. But what came next surprised everyone. The palace may have expected her to retreat into private life, but Maria had a different path in mind, one that stirred admiration, sparked debate, and left many within the royal household wondering if they had lost something far more precious than they knew. To understand how her quiet exit unsettled the palace, you have to return to the beginning, to the moment an 8-month-old George met the woman who would become his emotional anchor. Maria didn't crave attention. In fact, she had been trained to avoid it. But she wasn't just any nanny. Long before she walked the corridors of Kensington Palace, Maria Theresa Turrion-Borrallo was shaped by Norland College, one of the world's most prestigious training institutions for childcare professionals. Norland wasn't simply a school, it was a place where nannies for royalty, aristocrats, and global leaders were formed through a mix of tradition and tactical training, where etiquette was as important as emergency readiness. Maria graduated from Norland with quiet focus, not only skilled, but deeply aware that true effectiveness came from blending into the background while still holding a family together. That rare ability caught the attention of Prince William and Catherine. They weren't seeking a typical hire, they were seeking someone they could entrust with the future of the monarchy. After a rigorous selection process that examined her personality, ethics, and loyalty, Maria was chosen personally by the Duke and Duchess. It wasn't just a role, it was a mission, to safeguard the future king, quietly and faithfully. Her arrival at Kensington was as discreet as she was. No headlines, no photographs, no formal introduction. Her days started before dawn and ended long after bedtime stories. She floated through the halls, ever present but never intrusive, folding clothes, sterilizing bottles, always within reach to catch a fall, always careful to leave space. To outsiders, she was invisible. To George, she became everything. Maria didn't just follow royal protocol, she brought it to life. She saw the rules not as cold policies but as structures that needed compassion. She respected the lines between servant and family, but she walked that line with grace. She never imposed herself, but left a lasting mark, anticipating George's needs before he could voice them, staying through long fevers, remembering every small thing that brought him joy. There's no guidebook for raising a prince, but Maria was writing one day by day. Their connection grew in quiet ways, in the unspoken, in the stillness where trust is built, not taught. While the public focused on birthday portraits and balcony waves, Maria stood behind the curtain, holding up stuffed toys to draw out smiles. Her lullabies from Spain became part of his bedtime. Under her watch, George didn't just learn to walk, he learned that he didn't have to explain himself to be understood. But behind the grandeur of palace life was a relentless pressure. Raising a royal child meant raising him in a spotlight, his every move studied and analyzed. Maria, trained to fade into the background, became the only true constant in George's changing world. To the outside world, he was a prince. To her, he was simply George. Maria saw from the beginning that this little boy carried a weight far heavier than other children. It wasn't his title that set him apart, it was the burden it brought. Yet, even as a baby, George revealed an emotional depth that few noticed. He was quiet, attentive, and deeply aware of his environment. He didn't seek attention or the spotlight. He found comfort in repetition, calm mornings, and routines that made him feel safe. Maria, guided by intuition and experience, built that safe world for him, one careful piece at a time. She understood him long before he had words. A scrunched nose meant discomfort. A side glance meant curiosity. A clenched fist meant unspoken frustration. But Maria didn't brush away his emotions, she leaned into them. "Are you angry, or are you tired?" she would ask gently, allowing him to decide. George responded, not always with speech, but with trust. That trust grew in the quiet, lullabies from her homeland, favorite toys tucked gently beside him, cozy afternoons spent reading. She was there for his first song, his first word, Baba, spoken not for an audience but in the private calm of the nursery. As his steps grew steadier, so did their bond. Maria never shouted. She didn't have to. A glance, a soft word, a gentle redirection, George listened, not from fear but from love. She didn't just enforce rules, she protected a space where he could simply be a child, untouched by protocol or ceremony. Inside that nursery, Maria built a world where his laughter echoed without judgment and his questions were met with thoughtful answers, not rehearsed lines. She always knew the world would eventually mold him into a prince, but before that, she was determined he would simply be a boy who adored animals, asked why the moon moved, and wondered why strangers waved at passing cars. Her answers were always soft and kind. "Because seeing you makes them happy," she once said. It was a simple truth, and one he never forgot. But Maria understood, more than anyone, that time inside the palace didn't pause. George was growing, not just taller, but more aware. His laughter was less frequent, his questions more complex. Though their connection was never spoken aloud, it was so deeply stitched into his life that when the time came to let go, the pain would be far greater than anyone expected. Childhood, after all, doesn't last forever. And even behind palace walls, time had already begun to reshape everything. The world saw polished portraits, but she noticed the moments just before the smile. Maria never needed a camera flash to remember George's face, and she held on to the look in his eyes before the shutter clicked, when he searched for her and she held up a soft toy, mouthing a silly Spanish phrase meant just for him. To the public, he was a prince. To her, he was still the little boy who laughed too hard at made-up words and needed help tying his shoes. Every official photo, every carefully curated moment, carried traces of her, just outside the frame. The laughter behind the smile. The whispered mewing that lit up his face. These were the fragments of childhood Maria quietly gathered, the ones no lens could ever truly catch. They shared secrets no one else knew. The funny sound he made when finishing cereal. The name he gave her coat. On his birthdays, she didn't just show up, she created memories. On his 5th, when the guests had gone and the palace was quiet, she brought him to a small table in the staff area, cupcakes she'd baked, covered in sprinkles and filled with memories. He beamed, not because of the treat, but because it was theirs and theirs alone. The kind of moment that roots itself deep in your heart before your mind catches up. On peaceful days, they wandered the palace gardens, George collecting sticks he called treasure, Maria pretending not to see when he slipped a caterpillar into his pocket. Rainy afternoons meant puzzles, gentle encouragement, and the quiet joy of simply playing together. Winning didn't matter, the closeness did. He'd lean into her as she read, his fingers tracing the edge of her sweater, grounding himself in the comfort of her presence. Her Spanish became part of his daily rhythm, buenos dias, gracias, and little phrases tucked into his speech like souvenirs. They weren't just words. To George, they were the language of comfort. But change crept in quietly. George's questions grew heavier. He stared longer at faces in the crowd. He paid more attention to the news. Maria saw it all, not through grand gestures, but through the subtle signs, his quicker steps, his growing independence, his questions that no longer ended in wonder but began with uncertainty. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was coming. With every question, the nursery doors edged open, revealing a future that might not include her. She didn't lose him all at once. It happened in quiet shifts, without warning. One September morning, George dressed in his school uniform, straightened his tie with new confidence, and walked into a world that no longer revolved around nursery routines. School brought a new rhythm. His days were filled with lessons, classmates, and schedules. Maria, once the center of his little universe, became a steady presence in the background, still there, still important, but no longer the axis of his world. Still, she adapted. She packed his bag with gentle care, tucking in notes for tough days and favorite snacks after long weeks. She waited at the door when he came home, ready to wash mud off his shoes or hear him talk about Romans and butterflies. He still came to her, sometimes with questions, sometimes with pictures, sometimes with just a smile. But the moments were shorter, the space between them growing. And though Maria smiled, she felt the ache of each small distance. His questions now carried new weight. One evening after a charity event, he sat silently before finally asking, "Do all children have beds?" The air thickened. Maria, always calm, gave the honest answer. No, not every child does. He didn't ask anything more, he didn't need to. In the silence, Maria saw a shift. The child she had once rocked now carried the kind of questions that had no simple answers. She was proud. But the ache grew steady. Their time wasn't measured in hours anymore, but in fleeting moments, a glance at breakfast, a whispered gracias when handing her an empty lunchbox. One rainy day, she set up his favorite painting table, brushes, paints, everything just so. George walked past without pausing. She didn't call to him. She just quietly packed it all away, her hands slower than usual. It wasn't rejection, it was simply reality. He was growing up. And Maria, who had always known this day would come, now felt its sting. Still, she stayed. She continued to support him, love him, guide him, never expecting anything in return. She recognized the signs. Each gentle refusal, every independent step, was not a failure, but a sign of success. Her work, quiet, profound, was nearly complete. And though no one said it aloud, she could feel the end nearing. It didn't arrive with fanfare. The goodbye came quietly, behind closed doors. She sat with the future king and queen and listened as they said what she had long feared. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was the heavy kind, the kind that comes when something irreversible must be said. William and Catherine spoke gently. There was no anger, only sincerity. They thanked her for her years of dedication. They praised her for her care, her loyalty, her selflessness. But their message was clear: George was stepping into a new phase. He now had tutors, mentors, structured routines. The role Maria once held with such grace was no longer needed in the same way. They told her she had done her job with quiet brilliance. And now, it was time. She didn't cry. Not then. She simply nodded, listening, holding herself still to absorb every word. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "When do I stop?" There was a pause. Catherine, eyes filled with unspoken emotion, answered softly, "We thought you should choose. But George already knows. He wants to talk to you." Maria stood, the moment pressing heavily against her chest, and walked slowly toward the staircase she knew so well, every step echoing through more than just the palace walls. Over the years, she had carefully created a quiet world for a child who was never given the freedom to simply be one. George was at the window, drawing. When he saw her, he stood up, already a little taller than she remembered from even the day before. His eyes met hers, searching. "Mom told me," he said softly. "I don't want things to change." She gave him a gentle, knowing smile, one that held all the unspoken words only a mother figure could carry. "You're growing up," she said. "And it's time." He didn't argue, didn't turn away. He just stood there, trying to fix her face in his memory like a boy holding on to the final seconds of something he knew was ending. That night, Maria quietly packed her things. There wasn't much, she had never been one to accumulate belongings. Just a few books, a favorite cardigan, a frame drawing George made when he was 5, and a well-worn notebook filled with the small details only she cared about. The next morning, she walked him to breakfast for the last time. He sat beside her in silence. After finishing his meal, he handed her a small, wrapped package. Inside was a leather notebook. On the first page, in his neat and careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being my first teacher." She didn't say goodbye to the staff. There were no parting photos, no speeches, no public farewells. She left the palace as she had lived in it, quietly, respectfully, and almost invisibly. But this time, her absence echoed more loudly than any presence. Still, no one could have anticipated what she would do next, or how it would become global news. Maria disappeared from palace life, but she wasn't finished. She didn't move into another grand residence or retreat to luxury. Instead, she chose a modest home on a quiet street in West London. Life there was peaceful, uneventful. No interviews, no headlines, no memoirs. Just silence and the kind of deep reflection that comes after giving a decade of your life to someone else's future. The palace had granted her privacy, and she accepted it without hesitation. But beneath that quiet was something weightier than solitude. It was the ache of unfinished purpose, the quiet pull of a bond that doesn't break just because the job is done. Not long after she left, Norland College reached out with a new opportunity. A wealthy family in Belgravia needed a nanny. 2 children, a full staff, everything she had trained for. But Maria turned it down without meeting them. Not because it wasn't a good offer, but because she wasn't ready to begin again. Her heart, it seemed, hadn't moved on from George. Instead, she took a train to Bath and spent an afternoon with a retired nanny who had once served another royal household. Over tea, they spoke about what it meant to walk away, not just from a child, but from a whole world. How memories aren't stored in keepsake boxes but in habits, the way you fold clothes or hear familiar footsteps in halls that are no longer yours. Occasionally, letters reached her through palace channels, some from past Nolan students, others from children she had cared for long ago. She replied to every one, not with polished words, but with the same honest simplicity she had always offered George. Then, months after her departure, something unexpected arrived, a message. Not from William. Not from Catherine. But through the office. George was preparing for a major public appearance. It was important. And they needed her, not for good, just for a few days. Someone who knew the rhythm of royal life, someone he trusted. She quietly agreed. She returned the way she had left, through the staff entrance, unnoticed. George greeted her with a simple nod. He was taller now, more poised. Together, they worked through the preparation, the packing, the emotional readiness, the details she once knew better than anyone. When it was over, he handed her a folded piece of paper. Another drawing. Another dog. This one named Mudder. Her hands shook slightly as she held it. She didn't ask if she'd be back. She didn't need to. Something had shifted. This time, it wasn't a final goodbye. 8 months after leaving Kensington, Maria stepped into a spotlight she had never sought, one that would change the course of her story forever.